Hello and welcome to Monocle on Culture with me, Robert Bounds. On today's show, I'm speaking to the American artist Hank Willis Thomas, one of the most respected and tuned in of a crop of contemporary artists working across multiple media to ask big questions about where we are, who we are, how we got here, and where we're going. Oh yes, big themes. Willis Thomas's subjects are tackled conceptually in sculpture, photography, screen printing, video and installation, and it's plain to see that he's obsessed with imagery, from history, from news media, from folklore, art history, and also image making from the commercial sphere too. Are we being sold a story? Are we being sold a history? Willis Thomas is an expert in the subtle study of the semiotics of our image-drenched culture. I spoke to Hank Willis Thomas before the opening of his new show at the Pace Gallery in London. It's titled Kinship of the Soul, a title borrowed from the novelist Isaac Bashevis Singer, and it's a line that plays with the idea of the dots that connect us all. A few of the works are sculptural, figures that might be grasping for the sky or maybe flying or falling. But more of the works are retro-reflective collages made of scenes lifted from protests across the world, from last century and this one, that call to mind Henri Matisse's cutouts. The works also reference the artists Romare Bearden and Aaron Douglas, who worked with the realities of race, segregation and the cultural sweet spot known as the Harlem Renaissance, the 1920s African-American cultural revival. There is perhaps an idea in this show of hidden stories and overlooked histories, and so making these images from this retro-reflective material, similar to the stuff on a road sign that really pops under your car headlights, we walked at one speed around the gallery, and then, with a torch in hand, all was illuminated a second time, as you'll hear later on. Hidden depths, and then some. You'll hear Hank and I discussing the works, and then, as well-wishers poured in from the cold London evening, we found a quiet room in the gallery to talk about his growing up around images and the rest of his work as an artist. And we're here with Hank Willis Thomas at the opening of Kinship of the Soul. Thank you for having us at this brand new show, Hank. It's lovely to see you. We're talking ahead of the private view, and there have been technicians and visitors to the gallery walking around transfixed by the works, but also looking them up, down, looking at them different levels of light on. There's a lot to look at in these images. I wonder whether you could tell us about the genesis of the materials and the approach that you've taken with this show.
Well, I love that you almost said photos, because I tend to always talk about my work, whether it be a sculpture or a collage, and as a photograph, because photography is the basis or the underlying essence of everything that I do. I come from a photographic background and I see things through a photographic frame. All of these works are really attempt to blend things that are not often seen as connected, and the process is multifaceted. It includes screen printing, UV printing, a little bit of painting, and collaging, and a lot of cutting. And they're images made of multiple images, so they're kind of a collage within a collage and a collage. And then beneath that is a hidden layer of photography that can only be exposed under certain lighting circumstances if the viewer shines a light from their direct perspective.
I mean, these are retroflective. I wanted to get that in early at the top of our interview. These are retroflective materials that you're using, and they've been likened to the kind of the materials that you get if you shine your headlights on a stop sign when you're driving at night, kind of thing. So these are pointfully visually arresting in more than just the color scheme and the imagery that you're using, right?
It is actually the wayfinding material that is retroreflective, and I kind of came about it through a visit to a sign shop when I was working on a project, and saw this material illuminating, and I couldn't tell exactly what was happening. And then I realized that if I could use special printing techniques, manipulate it, play with it, that I could actually do something that was very unique. And so over the past decade, I've been kind of exploring the limits of this material, but it's actually boundless, and that's what's so fun about it. But also this conceptually using a wayfinding material to navigate through art and art history, and history in general is something that I think is something that I'm always thinking about.
Yeah, and these images contain multitudes, as you've kind of alluded to. Your work, you're an image maker in terms of your photography, making original images, but you're also playing here with collages, as you mentioned. There are a lot of archive images. So you're making images, but you're also researching images. You're doing a lot of deep diving into images and the meaning of those things. What are some of the things, outside of some of the abstract and figurative images we can see in front of us, what are they also made of?
Well, the surface images can be anything from seascapes to a variation of a world map that was popularized by Buckminster Fuller to I think the three artists who have been my primary kind of muses were Matisse, Aaron Douglas, and Romare Bearden, all artists who worked in the early side and mid 20th century and aren't often seen in conversation. And so I'm taking themes or images from their work and blending them, but beneath them are images of 20th century gathering, usually mostly nonviolent protests, but from all over the world, from England, from China, from different parts of Africa. I can see one from the Congo right here, and then all over the United States. And I think I've been kind of thinking about the ways in which art influences society, and usually not in direct ways, but in very kind of indirect ways, but that can be manifested later through social movements.
And the other artists and practitioners you've mentioned worked across literature, image making, all sorts of disciplines like you yourself do. They're not straight artists, quote unquote. Is that important to put these people, maybe unlikely influences, into a bag and shake them up somewhat?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, I mean, history isn't actually objectively true. It is just someone's reference point making connections. And what I found that is important is the more people who are making these reference points, I think the more compelling the story becomes and the more rich it becomes. And
do you mind if we get moving into this other room? I wanted to reference a couple of the works in here, Hank, which are figures that kind of look to me a little bit like a Minerva or something. I know I'm wrong in that. But these are images, these are figures that appear to be ascending, dancing, but maybe I'm wrong. There are also sort of flashes maybe of light or explosions. I don't know what they are, but they're very arresting, beautiful images that we see in front of us, and almost harlequin colored as well. Can you tell us what we're looking at here?
Well, yeah, so if you look at this sculpture, you'll see on one side, if you're looking directly in front of it, you'll see a blue figure that is looking towards the sky. And then if you go 90 degrees.
Should we do it?
Sure. And then you see another figure who looks like they could be dancing. But it's actually a figure from Matisse's Icarus series. And the other one is a figure from Aaron Douglas's representation of the Black or the Berry book. And as a person who comes from a photographic background, I'm always interested in kind of the angles and how the angle shapes what we see and the intersections and the reality. And so if you look behind this image, you'll see that those two images, this sculpture, those two images are what's actually being mashed up on a two
sort of fused together, right?
Yeah. And so I really am kind of been fascinated with the ways in which that Matisse was looking at kind of simple angular paper cuts later in his career, but the fact that also Aaron Douglas was doing that earlier in his career. And at this time is when, around in the early 30s, is when I believe Matisse first came to Harlem and was influenced by artists such as Aaron Douglas and kind of opened up some of his work and created the jazz series where this Icarus comes from.
I mean, art history used to look on these as the more simplistic end of things, but there's this huge backstory from which it came that Matisse presumably was channeling and a huge amount of image making, that he knew precisely what he was doing and what you were doing here.
And also because I think it's his jazz series because he was liberating himself from a traditional Western ways of working, you know, and as so many artists of his generation did in Europe. But also it coincided with a lot of, and the Harlem Renaissance, where a lot of black artists were actually finding their voice and expressing it. And so I love to see these connections.
The Harlem Renaissance, could you put that into a little bit of context for us as well? I mean, there's a rich seam of all sorts of stuff to tap into with that, I'm guessing.
Yes, it was a multifaceted art movement. I mean, I'm not sure if it was even a conscious movement, but it became known as a movement because there were so many creatives and political thinkers in Harlem interacting and creating a rich and vibrant society.
And well, up on the top floor here at Pace on Hanover Square, there's a mixture of abstract and more figurative figures. We step downstairs, and there are some works that are shaped like portholes. You walk down, and we see the sea and the dark sky, or it looks like that to me. Can you tell us a little bit about those? The sea means so many things to so many different artists, about art history, the idea of travel, the idea of cargo and not. What are they talking to?
The images are literally constructed of a sea of images. The collages are. And the sea of images are from different moments in time. Heraclitus said, "No man ever steps into the same river twice, for it's not the same man and it's not the same river." And I think about that. The river, I think about that also as the sea. And I think about that also as the sea of time and our life, like that we are not the same person we were yesterday. We weren't the same. We weren't dealing with the same challenges, but we are. It is still the current, and I guess the current is always current. So even when you're looking at the past and the current, you're engaging with the current. And so, in these collage works that are like, they do look like portals from a ship. Some of them, and yeah, I wanted to simplify some of the things that I was thinking about, and like give the viewer an opportunity just to look into the sea, to see the sea. Get it?
Sounds good to me. We're standing in front of one of your works here, Hank, which you're having a good close-up look at, and it looks to me almost like two figures who've got each other by the scruffs of the neck. So I wonder, what are we looking at here? I wonder how readable this image is.
So these two images are from two different artists' work. This is Circe from Romare Bearden's Odysseus series, and then a figure that is called The Toiler from a work by Aaron Douglas. Both of them are collaged. They're simplified, so there's only a portion of them, and juxtaposing kind of these figures.
These figures.
But I'm also, because I guess I'm thinking about these metaphors between kind of archetypical workers and archetypical figures in the legends that kind of shape our society, and the tension there, the temptation, the struggle, the intimidation, the curiosity, the confrontation.
In terms of the lighting of this show, it might look simple, but I guess it's not, because as you say, they've got these retro reflective qualities, these works, and Hank's standing back and squinting and looking at things from different angles with these as we talk through them.
Yeah, so if you stand over here, you can see this work is being illuminated probably by this wall behind me, and if you walk over here, you'll see like the images that we can now see to the right.
See faces and images.
Yeah. They emerge and they disappear, and like there's like this kind of curious challenge I always have with these works, which are like, how do you see it in its entirety? And it's virtually impossible to do that. And that's in real time and actually consume it, which is, I think, probably like reality.
And these are images from history, and it seems to constantly elude us. We can only see it from the angle that we're looking at it, and each of us sees it differently from the other viewer, I guess, as well.
Yeah. And as much as I've looked at the work, I'm always, every time I see them, I'm like, okay, now I can see it.
Yeah. It's I guess, what's the process of researching these images? Because when you search probably inevitably online for these images and examples of these images, Hank, you get there's a lot of verbiage as well. There's a lot of writing that accompanies these things. What sort of writing accompanies these images, depending upon where you find them?
I wouldn't say there is that much writing. I mean, there's a caption for this one was the launching of Apollo 10.
Yeah.
And maybe in Florida. There's one that I found actually in an archive that was for a South African insurance company during apartheid. And have you looked at these with the lights? Okay.
Just through, we had a test go with someone's iPhone.
So if you come over here and you put the mic to you.
Okay.
So.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's it.
So Hank's shining just a torch, right? Just a regular torch on this image, which looks like there's a black figure walking through what looks like a crack or a vortex or something. And there are amazing images. A lot of them, as you say, Hank, look like they came from an Apollo launch. A lot of people with dark glasses looking at the sky.
Mm-hmm. But also I see images from the Congo. And,
yeah.
Let's see. I see some money in there.
Yeah. Yeah, and on the right-hand side, we have these figures that might well be from the Congo.
Heroes, and see March on Washington. Yeah.
It's an absolutely stunning thing.
Yeah, and I love that revelation, the wow. So I think that's the thing that the work has these. I mean, that's what it's so fascinating. Like everything looks just so different under different conditions, right? I can hold the light and you can't really see anything, but if I put it right next to you, I can't see what you're seeing.
You must have been tempted to have a glitter ball in here.
Well, it doesn't work because it would be up there. That's my challenge always. But I have been tempted.
Well, that was our tour of Kinship of the Soul, and now let's close the door on the bustling gallery ahead of the private view to talk to Hank about his museum-centric childhood, his relationship with images, and another tilt at Kinship, namely an exhibition that Hank's curated at Pace's New York space of the work of Irving Penn, one of photography's great American heroes.
Hank, we found as we always do, a quiet anteroom in the gallery just to talk off the back of your show. And I read somewhere that you said that you'd sort of more or less grown up in museums, and talking about the history of images and all the images that you sourced for this particular show. I wonder whether you can give us a little bit of biography of that. I know your mum was a curator.
Yeah, so my mother, Deborah Willis, is an art historian and a curator, and her primary practice outside of being also an artist was presenting and representing images of made by people of African descent, mostly of people of African descent. And those images were mostly photographs. So she is in some ways the foremost historian of African American or Black photography, depending. I think as the scope widens, it's harder to say those things, but she published books. That her first book was called Black Photographers, 1840 to 1940, and it told a really unique story that there were Black people in the Caribbean and the United States that were making photography, which at the time that it was invented, basically. And that challenges a lot of what we have been taught about the Black experience, especially in the 19th century. And I think I grew up just kind of with this inherent questioning of like what's outside of the frame of history, because my mother's work has shown so much and so much more. And I wound up actually going to museum studies program in high school, but my mother worked at the Smithsonian and also the Schomburg Center in New York. And museums are unique places. They're some of the only places, along with libraries, where people go there to get enlightened. They go there because they don't know something. They go there to learn. Whereas in like maybe a concert or a sporting event, you're going to be entertained. And so I have always loved learning. And so my practice reflects what I've always loved, which is going places that I don't know anything and learning things, but then also seeing the connection to things that others don't, and then presenting that.
And museums, in the era when you were a kid, they've always had a hierarchy of the way images are presented, histories are presented, etc., etc. Do they feel like different places to walk into now than they did when you were child as recommended by your mother, I wonder? When you come to work with me today and see what you think of it kind of thing? What was that like as a kid?
I was a kid. So.
Wasn't that long ago, Hank?
No, quite some time ago. But I was playing with my, G.I. Joe action figures and Hot Wheels toys. So I wasn't really conscious of kind of what was going on. It was all actually happening kind of through osmosis. But I would say the world's changed dramatically. I mean, the people we see represented in power, there's more equanimity around gender and ethnicity, and there isn't necessarily the same old assumption of who are the power makers, even though that might be true and large. But I think the world is much more kind of complex because it's harder to see things in black and white. Well, it's a lot easier when I was a child.
Yeah. I know you've, with that upbringing and the expertise that were possibly at your fingertips, although you were a kid, so you were, as you say, absorbing things by osmosis rather than lectures. You've obviously famously been really interested in commercial imagery and how things are sold through imagery to us. I know you did a billboard series a few years back. I wonder if you could tell us about that, the most potent and sort of simple kind of moment of largesse is a billboard, I suppose, for commercial imagery. What was the kickoff for that, and what were you talking about there?
So me and my friends started an organization or a project called Four Freedoms, and the goal was to put critical discourse into political discourse using fine art thinking. And we were thinking about signage and political signage, and we did a lot with that, but then also realizing that all art is political, and the most ubiquitous presentation space for art is the billboard. And we don't think about ads as art. And so we decided that we, as artists, wanted to actually use those canvases. And so we made artwork, and now we just published a book, Four Freedoms, Where Do We Go From Here, that consists of 600 billboards made by over 400 artists. I would say posing questions rather than telling people what to think. And it's just been really fun to kind of appropriate a very popular commercial landscape with something that has a different currency.
When I think of billboards, and especially billboards in the US, the primary questions that are being asked are, have you been in an accident or whatever, right? There's a lot of this. And what we'd call ambulance chasing billboards. You're obviously asking a very different sort of question with yours and with the presentation of art on this kind of none more commercial backdrop. What kind of questions were you asking? I mean, maybe they weren't explicitly questions, but...
Well, in my billboards, one that was actually here in London said, "Who taught you to love?" And that question is very loaded. Who taught you to love?
It's too personal.
Oh, is it? You don't like the microphone turned on you. That's exactly what the work is attempting to do, to challenge us to really think about why we're afraid to go to our roots, and because there's probably so much information that could enrich us if we were able to connect with our past in a way and express that openly.
I love the idea of that, the notion of that, and the question, despite my rabbit in the headlights look. But we come back to what we started talking about, perhaps with your show here at Pace, which is the illumination that, that having your headlights on can make you see a lot of different things depending upon the way you're looking at it. I don't want to be too tying up the strings in a convenient way here, but there is something about that. You've thought about that must run through your work somehow.
Yeah, it does. There is the theme of the show, Kinship of the Soul, is really about, for me, that there is just, in some ways, if you look throughout space and time, this one spirit that it's looking for safety and being seen and being free. And it takes various forms and it takes various risks. And sometimes it has to be reborn, but the spirit is always there. And oftentimes we look at people from a different moment. We're like, oh, why did they do that? Or how did they get through that? But in all of those people, they are our ancestors. We are their legacy. And thus, with moments like this, when hopefully people will be able to look back at us and ask questions rather than, who knows? we should be thinking about, as many people have talked about, and my friend Nora Batin introduced me to this concept of our future ancestors. Who are our future ancestors, and what is our responsibility to them?
And just finally, you currently have a show called Kinship in New York, which is you've curated a show of Irving Penn's photographs. Do you put a different? What does the artist who's a curator? What are you using a different kind of muscle there? We're talking about the work that you've made here today. What about when you're curating a show?
No, it was very similar, actually. It was like looking at images, because he had a 6-decade-plus career, and he was very curious about various things, and he traveled the world, and not enough has been discussed about some of the connections between his various bodies of work, his various subjects, and also even the way that he might have framed different things. So I'm looking at the way that he framed still lifes that might be similar. This the way he framed living people, and the way that fabric might be connected to paper that he photographed. And thinking about this one person who's like, he's always looking for the same thing. He's looking to make this one special connection that comes from awakening. And I think for him, you can see these echoes in his work.
I guess someone that danced between the commercial and the editorial and the artistic in all the different images he took and all the different commissions he took as well. I'm guessing that must also, the intention behind all those different things you must find fascinating, the way that you've talked about your own work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he was an artist that influenced me because he his work couldn't be confined in a simple box, if you wanted to look at it all.
Speak of the devil, we're talking to Hank Willis Thomas. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that was the excellent Hank Willis Thomas. The London show, Kinship of the Soul, is at the Pace Gallery in Hanover Square until the 21st of December. And his Irving Penn show is at Pace on West 25th Street in New York City, and that's also on until the 21st. Monocle on Culture is produced by Sophie Monaghan-Coombs and Steph Chungu, who also edits the show. We'll all be back at the same time next week, but until then, from me, Robert Bounds, thanks for tuning in.